I want to tell you what happened on October 14th, 2019, but I need to start a little before that, because the day itself won't make any sense without the weeks leading up to it. My name is Dale Corrigan. I'm 63 years old. I live on 42 acres of timbered land in Clearwater County, Idaho, up a gravel road off US 12 near a stretch of the Loxa River that most people drive past without stopping. The closest town with a grocery store is Kooskia, 31 miles west. The closest hospital is in Grangeville, another 40 miles south of that. If you know the Loxa country, you know what I'm talking about. Old-growth cedar and Doug fir on the north-facing slopes, ponderosa on the south faces, a river that runs green and cold even in August, and a wilderness boundary to the east that is exactly as wild as it sounds. The Selway Bitterroot Wilderness. 4.5 million acres of the most remote country in the lower 48. No roads in. No roads, period, once you cross the boundary. Just ridgeline after ridgeline going east until you run into Montana. I bought the property in 2009 after I retired from Idaho Power. 31 years as a lineman, most of it in the Snake River Plain, some of it up in the timber country near Grangeville and the Clearwater drainages. I knew what I was getting into. The cabin was built in 1952 by a man named Ivar Holstad, who homesteaded out here before the wilderness designation locked up the country to the east. It's a solid structure, log walls, a metal roof, a river rock fireplace that heats the main room like a furnace once it gets going. I added a bathroom and a propane line in the first year. I've got a generator for when I need it, a satellite dish for internet that works about 60% of the time, and a well that's never run dry. I heat with wood. Always have, out here. There's no shortage of standing dead timber on the property, and I cut and split my own supply every fall. 8 to 10 cords to get through the winter, depending on how bad it goes. Before we get into it, let me know where you're watching from, and if you've had an encounter like this. I want you to understand the daily reality of my life on that property, because the story I'm going to tell you grew out of that daily reality, and it only makes sense inside of it. I'm up by 6 most mornings. I make coffee on the propane stove, drip coffee, nothing fancy, the same Folgers I've been drinking since I was 22. I eat breakfast, usually oatmeal or eggs from the chickens I keep in a small coop behind the woodshed. I have a morning routine that I've refined over 11 years of living alone out here. And the center of that routine, in the fall, September through early November, is the wood. Getting the wood in is the main event of the year. Every other task is scheduled around it. The property runs roughly north to south, with the cabin in the lower middle portion about 100 yards from the forest road and maybe 250 yards from the Loxa, which you can hear but not see from the front porch because of the cottonwood and alder along the bank. The lower portion of the property is pasture that Holstad had cleared for a small cattle operation. I don't run cattle, but I keep it mowed, and I used to let a rancher neighbor hay it until he sold out in 2017. Above the cabin, the ground rises, first through a belt of mixed timber, cottonwood, aspen, some young ponderosa that came in after an old selective cut, and then steeper through second-growth timber into the old ridge timber at the top. The upper property, the part that climbs toward the national forest boundary, is steep. North-facing draws full of big timber, western red cedar in the wet spots, grand fir on the mid-slopes, ponderosa on the ridgelines. Some of that timber is old enough that the bark is a foot thick and the trunk is too wide for me to reach around. There are patches up there that were never logged. The creek runs through a draw about 400 yards above the cabin. It's a small stream, unnamed on the maps I have, but it runs clear and cold year-round, even in the dry summers. It feeds down from snowpack on the Bitterroot country to the east. In the fall, when the water is low, you can hear it from a long way off, a sound like someone running their hand over paper, constant, patient. In wet years, it runs high enough to make noise you'd call a rushing sound. Either way, it's a landmark. When I'm working the upper part of the property, I can orient myself by the creek, even when I can't see it through the timber. I've been working the upper property in a slow progression since 2009. Every year I go a little further up, take what's accessible, and leave the rest for another season. The northeast ridge is the far boundary, about 500 yards above the cabin, and by the fall of 2019 I was getting close to it. There's standing dead timber up there that I'd been eyeing for years, big ponderosa snags, dried out and clean burning, the kind of wood that a fireman or a furnace operator would call choice fuel. But the terrain up there is steep enough, and the access roads are narrow enough that getting equipment to those snags is a problem. And I'd been deferring it, planning, each year, to figure out the equipment problem before the next season. Never quite figuring it out.
Quick thing before we get into it. I have a book coming out. It's called the Bigfoot Codex. It's a compilation of all my research and findings. It's kind of my baby. So if you want to check it out, link's down below. And let's get you back to the video.
In the fall of 2019, I'd been having some trouble. Not with the work. The work was the same, as always. With what was up there. It started in late August. I'd gone up to the northeast ridge to scout new timber. Just me and a handsaw to mark what I wanted to drop that fall. I'd been up there probably a dozen times over the years, always in daylight, always on the same rough trail I'd worn into the slope over years of repeated trips. I knew that ground. I knew which deadfalls were on the path, and where the ground went soft near the creek crossing and where you had to watch your footing on the shale. About halfway up the draw, maybe 250 yards above the cabin, I found a pile. Not a brush pile, not a deadfall, not anything I could explain with the usual list of things. A stack of logs, 8 of them, each about 14 inches in diameter and 5 feet long, laid crosswise in alternating directions like a log cabin corner. Interlocked. The logs were peeled of bark, not by a machine. There was no sawdust, no machine marks on the stumps where they'd come from, and the marks on the wood were long and curved, like something had stripped them by hand, pulling in a single motion from one end of the log to the other. There was no equipment on my property that could have done that. My tractor can't get to that draw. No logging crew had been in there. No logging company had rights to that land. I stood there for about 5 minutes, thinking through every reasonable explanation I could come up with, and running out of reasonable explanations faster than I expected. The stack was maybe 4.5 feet tall. The individual logs were clean, like they'd been worked. Not gnawed, not torn, worked. Something had put deliberate effort into what I was looking at. I took a picture with my phone. I still have it. If you zoom in on the corner joints, you can see the way the stripped wood is smooth, in long, even strokes. The way you'd see it if something had peeled the bark with its hands, pulling downward in one motion, from the top of the log to the bottom. A bear can strip bark. A bear pulls outward, in patches. A bear doesn't make long single-pass strokes down the full length of a log, and a bear certainly doesn't stack what it peels into interlocked corners. I went back to the cabin. I told myself it was interesting. I told myself I'd look into it. 2 days later, I went back up to mark timber, and the stack was gone. All 8 logs moved. The ground was undisturbed except for 2 depressions in the soft soil at the base of where the stack had been. Oval impressions, maybe 16 inches long, side by side, about 18 inches apart, each one pressed 3 to 4 inches deep into ground that didn't have any give to it. I crouched down and looked at them for a while. The depressions had a midpoint ridge, a raised bar of compressed soil running across the middle of each one, the way a foot leaves an impression if the arch doesn't contact the ground fully, if the foot is divided into ball and heel by the natural arch of the plantar. I'd seen enough elk tracks in my life to know that elk tracks don't look like that. I'd been around enough bear sign to know that a bear standing on its hind legs leaves a rear paw print that's wide at the heel and narrows at the toe. And these didn't look anything like that. These looked like the balls of 2 feet, something that stood flat. I took more pictures. I went home. The thing is, I want to be honest with you about what I did and didn't do at that point. I didn't call anyone. I didn't report it to the Forest Service. I didn't post about it online. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years in the electrical trade in Idaho, which is not a culture that rewards that kind of thing. A man who calls the Forest Service to say there are mysterious log structures on his property, and he thinks something with big feet moved them, is going to spend the rest of his life being that guy. I didn't want to be that guy, so I kept it to myself, and I went back to work. September passed. I was up on the northeast ridge 3 or 4 times a week, cutting and hauling. I marked about 40 trees I wanted to drop, got 15 of them down, got 8 of those bucked and hauled to the splitting area before the weather turned. The first cold snap hit around September 20th, which is early for Clearwater County, but not unheard of. Temps down into the low 20s at night, frost on the grass in the morning, the larch turning yellow on the slopes to the south. I pushed the pace because I needed to get ahead of the first real snow. During those weeks in September, I noticed things. Not dramatic things, not anything you'd point to and say, there, that's it, that's the moment I knew. Just accumulations, small things that piled up until they had a weight that was hard to ignore. The first was the quiet. I've been cutting wood on this property for 10 years. I know what it sounds like when the saw is off, and I'm loading rounds onto the tractor. There are Steller's jays up there and nuthatches, and in September you usually get Clark's nutcrackers working the high stuff. Squirrels. The sound of squirrels in the dry timber is constant in the fall, chittering, scolding, the thud of cone drop. I started noticing that certain spots in the upper draw had no squirrel sound. Not quiet. I mean actively, conspicuously, without squirrel sound. The way a room goes quiet when someone walks in that everyone is watching. A radius of silence that moved when I moved. That was always about 100 yards uphill from wherever I was working. I know what causes that kind of quiet. A predator causes it. Not a cruising predator, a predator that has stopped and is present. Elk create it when they bed. Mountain lions create it when they're hunting. Bears create it, sometimes, when they're feeding on something that's drawing other animals' attention. The squirrel silence I was experiencing on the northeast ridge had the quality of a predator presence quiet. But it wasn't stationary in the way a bedded elk is stationary. It tracked. It was always uphill of me, always a consistent distance, and it moved when I moved. Something was following my progress through the draw. I told myself it was a mountain lion. There are lion in those hills. I've seen tracks in the snow above the cabin, and once, years ago, I saw an actual cat on the game trail above the creek. Just for a second, the way you always see them, a tawny length of muscle slipping sideways between 2 trees, and then nothing. A lion could follow my progress from above, without sound. But lions don't follow you for 3 weeks, every morning, up and down the same draw. Lions are opportunists. They assess and move on. Whatever was following my progress in September was doing it consistently and deliberately, in a way that wasn't opportunism. The second thing was the smell. I'm going to try to describe it accurately, because inaccurate descriptions aren't useful to anyone. It was not a skunk smell, not exactly. It was muskier than that, and it had a quality that I associated at first with wet dog, but wetter than any dog I'd ever been near. More animal, more dense, more complex. There was something underneath that I kept trying to identify and couldn't quite land on. Something like an old hide that's been left in the sun too long. Something faintly sour like a fermentation smell. The kind you get near a composter in July. Not a rotting smell. A living smell. A large living thing that was close by and that I couldn't see. I smelled it maybe 4 or 5 times in September, never more than 5 or 10 minutes at a stretch, and always in the upper third of the draw near the ridge. Once it was strong enough that I actually stopped walking and stood for a moment just breathing it, trying to locate it. It came from upslope, from the northeast, from somewhere in the timber between the creek and the ridge crest, and it was so present and so specifically animal that I had the involuntary response you have to a smell that belongs to something large and alive. The small hairs on my arms stood up, and I became very aware of what was behind me and above me at the same time. The third thing was the sound. This one happened once, and once was enough. On a Thursday evening in the second week of September, I was loading the last of a run of rounds onto the tractor about 90 minutes before dark. The chainsaw was off. The tractor was idling at low throttle around 700 RPM, and from above me, from the northeast ridge, came a sound that I have thought about every day since and still don't have the right word for. It was a vocalization, not an animal I know, not a bugling elk. I know what that sounds like. I've hunted elk in this country since I was 22, and the bull bugle is a sound I can identify from a long way off. Not a coyote howl, not a cougar screech, not a great horned owl, which can make sounds at night that unsettle people who don't know what they're hearing. Those sounds all have context. They fit in the world you know you're living in. This was different in the way that a word in a foreign language is different from random noise. There was structure to it, and the structure felt intentional in a way that random animal sound doesn't. Low at first, then rising, then dropping back down, and holding a long note that I felt more in my chest than heard with my ears. The tractor idles at about 700 RPM. That note was below the tractor's idle frequency. You don't hear sounds below that idle frequency. You feel them as vibration in your sternum and your diaphragm. I felt it, and it went on for several seconds, and when it stopped, the draw was absolutely still. The jays went quiet. The nutcrackers went quiet. Even the creek seemed to quiet, though I know that's not possible. A creek doesn't stop at a sound. But everything else did, and I sat on the tractor for a minute without moving, with my hands on the steering wheel, doing the thing you do where your body goes, ahead of your thinking, where some part of you below reasoning is already very sure about something and is waiting for the thinking part to catch up. After a minute, I put the tractor in gear and went down the hill. I didn't rush. I didn't run. I just went down at a reasonable pace, and I did not look back at the ridge. That felt important, though I could not have told you why. That was September 11th. I remember the date because I wrote it down when I got back to the cabin. I keep a notebook for the property, maintenance, weather, wildlife, observations. The entry for that evening is 3 lines. Vocalization from northeast ridge, not cougar, not elk, nothing I could put in a field guide. Estimated source 150-200 yards northeast. Left the draw. I went back the next morning. I always go back. 31 years as a lineman teaches you that the scary thing is usually just a thing, and the thing that's scary is usually not as bad as the dark your imagination puts it in. I went up to the northeast ridge the next morning and found nothing unusual. No fresh structures, no tracks in the overnight frost. The jays were back. The squirrels were back. The draw was exactly as I'd left it. I kept cutting. I want to tell you about one more thing from September, because it happened and it matters, and leaving it out would make this account incomplete. On a Sunday afternoon in late September, I was bucking a big ponderosa I'd dropped the day before, a snag about 90 feet tall and maybe 22 inches at the breast height diameter, which in that dry ridge timber is not an exceptional size. I was working near the base of the tree, making rounds, when the saw kicked out on a bind, and I had to stop and wedge the cut open before I could restart. I stood up from the crouch I'd been working in, and as I straightened up, I looked upslope, out of habit. I always check upslope when I'm working for roll hazard. Timber on a slope can roll when you least expect it, and you watch your footing. There was something on the ridge, on the crest of the northeast ridge where the timber thinned out enough that you could see sky above the canopy. There was a dark shape. Not a tree, not a stump. It was standing. It was not moving. And even at the distance, I'd call it 150 yards, maybe 170. There was no question in my mind about whether it was bipedal. It was standing on two legs, upright, with a posture that was both familiar and fundamentally wrong. The proportions were off. The shoulders were too high and too wide for the head above them. The arms, where I could see them at the sides of the silhouette, were too long, below the midpoint of the thigh, well below where a human arm would hang. It was standing in partial shade from a large ponderosa to its left, and the combination of shade and distance made it difficult to get detail. But the silhouette itself was clear. Whatever I was looking at was large. I have no way to judge the exact height at that distance, but the proportions of its silhouette against the tree line put it well above 6 feet, possibly well above 7. It was looking in my direction, not at me specifically. I couldn't tell that from the silhouette. But it was oriented toward the lower draw, toward where I was working. It stood there for what I think was about 15 seconds, though my sense of time in that moment was not reliable. Then it turned and walked into the timber to the east and was gone. It didn't move fast. It moved like something that wasn't alarmed, deliberate, unhurried, like something that had looked at what it wanted to look at and had other things to do. I stood there with the chainsaw in my hands, the engine still running. I set it down on the log. I sat down next to it. I stayed there for a while. That was September 28th. I added it to the notebook. By early October, I had most of what I needed down and bucked. I was behind on the splitting. I'd been spending more time on the saw than on the splitter, because the weather window was narrow, and I wanted to get the timber down while the ground was still firm enough for the tractor. I had maybe 12 cords of rounds piled in the upper splitting area, which is a flat section of the property about 70 yards up from the woodshed. I'd built a rough sorting wall up there years ago, a stack of old rounds I'd set on end to create a windbreak, and I worked in the lee of that wall when the cold came down from the north. That upper splitting area was my work zone for the first 2 weeks of October. October 14th was a Monday. I got up at 6, had oatmeal and coffee, put on my Carhartt canvas work coat and my wool hat, and went up to the splitting area by 7:15. It was 38 degrees and clear. There was frost on the rounds and on the sorting wall, and the sky to the east over the Bitterroot was going from dark blue to pink. That kind of morning. The kind that makes you glad you live where you live and do what you do. I was splitting by 7:30, using the hydraulic splitter I've had since 2013, a Spico S40, 22-ton hydraulic, powered off the tractor's PTO. Good machine. It does the work your back used to do. I want to talk about the physical experience of what happened, because I've talked to 3 cardiologists since then, and I want to make sure I represent it accurately. What I had was a heart attack. A STEMI, a ST elevation myocardial infarction, caused by a blockage in the left anterior descending artery. The Widowmaker, my cardiologist in Grangeville, called it, with the particular deadpan that doctors use when they've said something 20 times a week for 15 years and stopped hearing how it sounds. The left anterior descending artery supplies blood to the largest portion of the heart muscle, the front wall, and part of the septum of the left ventricle, which is the chamber that does the main work of pumping oxygenated blood to the body. When the LAD occludes, a large section of the myocardium begins to die rapidly from lack of oxygen. This is why an LAD occlusion carries the highest mortality rate among coronary events, especially in situations where the patient is remote and cannot summon help quickly. I didn't know any of that on the morning of October 14th. I knew I was 63 years old, and I hadn't had a cardiac event before. And my last physical, in May, had shown nothing remarkable. My blood pressure ran a little high, 138/86 on the day of the physical. My cholesterol was at the high end of acceptable LDL around 135. My doctor in Kooskia, Dr. Renata Webb, had recommended I reduce sodium and take a baby aspirin daily. I was taking the aspirin. I had not significantly reduced the sodium because I am 63 years old and I live alone in the Idaho backcountry, and there are limits to how much self-improvement I'm willing to undertake without external pressure. The symptoms started around 8:15, when I'd been splitting for about 45 minutes. The first thing I noticed was that my left arm hurt. Not a sharp pain, a dull, persistent ache that started at the elbow and moved up toward the shoulder. My first thought was that I'd strained it, because I'd been moving rounds all morning and my form gets sloppy when I'm tired. I stopped splitting and shook the arm out and stretched it. The ache didn't go. It spread into my shoulder, then across my chest, and by the time it reached my chest, it wasn't dull anymore. A tight sensation, like something was compressing my rib cage from the outside, like being squeezed by something very large and very patient. That tightening, when I say it that way, sounds manageable. It wasn't. It was the kind of sensation that removes all other thoughts. You're not thinking about anything else when that's happening. You're only thinking about the thing in your chest, then the sweat. I was working in 38-degree weather and I broke into a cold sweat that soaked through my flannel shirt inside 20 seconds. Cold sweat is not exertion sweat. Cold sweat is a physiological response to reduced cardiac output, your body redirecting blood away from the skin's peripheral vessels and toward the core and the vital organs, because something has gone wrong with the pump. Cold sweat is your body telling you the situation is serious before your brain has fully processed the situation as serious. My training as a lineman included basic first aid, CPR, AED operation, the signs of cardiac distress. Electric utilities take this seriously because linemen die on the job from cardiac events at a higher rate than the general population, the physical exertion, the occasional shock exposure, the stress of the work. I'd sat through the training more times than I could count. I knew what was happening. I just didn't want to know. I sat down on a round, reached for my phone in my left breast pocket. My left arm was not working right. The ache had become something closer to a numbness, a dead weight feeling like the arm had fallen asleep from the shoulder down. I got the phone out with my right hand. I'd had cell service out here since 2015 when Verizon put a new tower up on the ridge south of US 12. 1 bar, sometimes 2, depending on the weather and the season. October is usually a reliable month for it. The leaf cover is down on the deciduous trees by early October, and that helps the signal. I got the lock screen off and dialed 911 and got a ring. When the dispatcher answered, I said my name, and I said I was having a cardiac event, and I said I was at 1847 Holstad Trace Road in Clearwater County, which is the address of my property, the access road off the main Forest Service road. I said I was in the upper portion of my property, about 70 yards uphill from the main cabin, in the splitting area. I said I was alone. I said the nearest landing zone for a helicopter was the meadow behind the cabin. The dispatcher, a woman whose voice was very calm and steady, stayed with me. She told me to stay on the line. She told me not to move. She said search and rescue was being dispatched and the flight time from the Clearwater Valley Hospital in Orofino would be approximately 30 to 40 minutes, and given my location, they would need to identify a landing zone near the cabin. I said the meadow behind the cabin. I said it was large enough, probably 70 yards across the long axis. I said the access road was gated, but that the combination was 4471, and she should relay that to the ground team. She said she was relaying it. She told me to keep talking to her. I said I understood. I put the phone down on the round next to me with the call still active. The dispatcher kept talking. I could hear her voice from the phone, asking me questions, telling me to keep breathing slowly and steadily. I could hear her, but I was already past the point where answering was easy. Then the chest pain got worse. There's a medical term, diaphoresis, for the kind of sweating that accompanies a cardiac event. There's another term, pre-syncope, for the sensation that precedes loss of consciousness, a tunneling of vision, a drop in the volume of everything around you, a sense of the world becoming very small and very far away, a feeling that you are receding from your own body rather than your body receding from consciousness. I know these terms because I've read extensively since, trying to reconstruct what happened to me in accurate language. At the time, on that round, at 8:20 or 8:25 on a Monday morning in October with frost on the woodpile and the bitterroot going pink in the east, I did not have any language for it at all. I had the sensation of sitting inside a room that was getting smaller. I had the sensation of my own heartbeat becoming something I could hear, not feel, a sound like something wrong inside a machine, an irregular knock that shouldn't be there. I heard the dispatcher's voice from the phone. I heard the squirrels in the timber above me, which struck me as an odd thing to register in that moment. They were back, they were there, and whatever had been keeping them quiet for weeks was not present at that moment. And some part of my brain, the part that was still functioning clearly, noted that and found it strange. And then I had no sensations at all. I went down off the round. I don't know if I fell sideways or forward. I don't remember going down. The next thing I can account for, which I am told was approximately 45 minutes later, based on the SAR team's timeline, was the sound of helicopter rotors from the south, very close, and the feel of cold ground under my left cheek and grass. Not the packed dirt of the splitting area, grass and soft ground, and the smell of the earth and of something else, that smell, the one from the drawers, the one I had been smelling on and off since early September, thick and musky and animal and close, very close, not fading the way a smell fades when its source has left, present in the way a smell is when the source is still nearby. I was not in the splitting area. I was lying on my back at the edge of the open meadow behind the cabin, maybe 20 feet from the back corner of the structure. That meadow is 170 yards downhill from the splitting area, through timber past 2 deadfall logs that a person would have to either step over or go around. There was no way I walked there. I could not have walked anywhere in the condition I was in, and even if I had, I would not have gone uphill toward the ridge and then down through the timber to the meadow. That route makes no sense. The direct path from the splitting area to the back of the cabin goes through a section of second-growth timber with no trail, steep enough in spots that you watch your footing even when you're healthy. I have no memory of moving. My phone was not with me. That's important. When I sat down on the round with the 911 call still active, my phone was on the round next to me. When a SAR found me in the meadow, I did not have my phone. They found it, later, 38 feet up the meadow from where I was lying, placed, and I will use that word deliberately, placed on a flat-topped rock at the edge of the meadow where the grass met the tree line. Not dropped, not thrown, set down on the flat face of the rock as if someone had found a surface and set it there intentionally. The call was still active. The GPS coordinates transmitted by the phone during that call were what brought SAR to the precise location on my property. Without those coordinates, they would have gone to the cabin address, not found me there, and begun a broader search of the property. 45 minutes of active cardiac ischemia. That is 45 minutes of your heart muscle dying in sections from oxygen deprivation, is a very long time. My cardiologist said I was very close to the line. She said the difference between the outcome I had and a different outcome was probably less than 10 minutes. Someone moved me from the splitting area to the meadow. Someone set my phone on a rock in a location where it could transmit a clear GPS signal and where the responding SAR team would see it. Someone carried a 230-pound man who was unconscious and uncooperative in the way that unconscious people are uncooperative, 170 yards downhill through timber and over 2 deadfall logs, and laid him in a clearing where a helicopter could land, and placed his phone where it would be found. I don't know what to do with that. I have thought about it every day since October 14th, 2019, and I still don't know exactly what to do with it, but I'm going to try to tell you everything I know. The IR team that responded was out of the Clearwater Valley Hospital in Orofino, a ground crew and a helicopter, an air medical unit that they coordinate with for remote cardiac cases. The flight time from Orofino to my property in good conditions is closer to 30 minutes than 40, and October 14th was a clear day with light winds. The team lead was a paramedic named Craig Tollison. I've talked to Craig twice since my recovery. The first time by phone, the second time in person over coffee in Kuskia, about 6 months after the incident. Craig is a calm, methodical person, the kind of person you want doing that job in that country, and he didn't embellish anything he told me. He told me exactly what they found, in the order they found it, with the precision that good field personnel develop over years of writing accurate incident reports. The helicopter identified the landing zone from the air, the meadow behind the cabin, which is the obvious choice, and which is why the placement of me in the meadow matters. The meadow is visible from the air as an open area behind a log structure at the end of a gravel road. Any pilot approaching from the south would see it and identify it as the appropriate landing zone for a residential call at that address. A person or thing that knew this would put me in the meadow. A person or thing that didn't know this might put me in the splitting area, or at the cabin door, or anywhere else on the property that wasn't specifically useful for a helicopter response. But someone put me in the meadow. Craig told me the first thing his crew noticed when they landed was a line in the grass. The meadow grass was knee-high at that point, late-season growth, and it was bent. Not in the wind pattern. The wind that morning was out of the north, and the bent grass ran perpendicular to the wind direction, running from the tree line on the north edge of the meadow toward the position where I was lying. Craig described it as a drag track. Wide, he said, maybe 3 feet across, consistent in width, like something very large had moved through the grass without lifting its feet completely, pushing the grass ahead of it in both directions like a bow wave. The track ran from the tree line straight to me. Then it stopped. No continuation past my body, no return track, no area of disturbance that suggested something had moved back into the timber the way it had come. Whatever had made the track had come to where I was, put me down, and was gone. Craig and his crew stabilized me in the field and got me airborne within 12 minutes of landing. I was in the cardiac catheterization lab in Grangeville inside 90 minutes of the 911 call. They placed a stent in my LAD. I was in the ICU for 4 days and in a regular room for 3 more. I went home on October 24th. During those 10 days in the hospital, I had a lot of time to think and not much to do. I thought about the log structure in August. I thought about the smell and the sound in September. I thought about the thing I'd seen on the ridge crest on September 28th, the silhouette with the wrong proportions. I thought about what Craig Tollison had told me about the drag track in the grass. And I thought about the pile of deadfall logs at the bottom of the trail down from the splitting area. 2 logs, each maybe 10 inches in diameter, lying across the path where I would have had to step over them to get down to the meadow. When I'd walked up to the splitting area that morning, those logs had been lying across the path. When a SAR hiked up from the meadow to secure the scene and retrieve my equipment, the logs were not across the path. They'd been moved to the side, pulled off the trail, and laid parallel to it, 1 on each side, so that someone or something coming down through the timber with a load wouldn't have to step over them. I'm going to say that again because it took me a while to absorb it. 2 deadfall logs that I had been stepping over every morning for 3 weeks when I went up to the splitting area had been moved off the path and laid to either side before I was brought down through that spot. The path had been cleared. Whatever carried me down had moved the obstacles first, or at the same time, but the logs were moved, and I was on the other side of where they'd been. That's not animal behavior. That's not anything I have a category for in 31 years of working in the outdoor world and 10 years of living alone in the Idaho backcountry. That's problem solving. That's seeing an obstacle on a route and removing it because the route needs to be passable. That's something that understood, at some level, that a large unconscious person cannot be easily carried over a log lying across a path. I came home on October 24th. My neighbor, Lloyd Breck, who has a place on the Loxa about 6 miles west of mine, had checked on the cabin while I was in the hospital and stocked the kitchen with enough that I didn't need to make the drive to Kuskia right away. Lloyd is 71. He's lived on the Loxa for 40 years. When he brought the groceries over the first day I was home and asked what had happened, I told him most of it. The cardiac event, the SAR response, the recovery. I didn't tell him about the drag track or the phone or the logs, not yet. Lloyd is not a person who is going to dismiss something out of hand, but he's also not a person who responds well to a story he can't put a frame around, and I hadn't put a frame around it yet myself. I want to be a fair witness to my own experience here. A fair witness doesn't insist on an impossible explanation when a possible one exists, even if the possible one is less satisfying. So let me go through the possible explanations and tell you where each one stops working. Explanation 1. I didn't lose consciousness when I fell. I had a brief loss of consciousness, but recovered enough to walk down to the meadow, then lost consciousness again. Problems with this explanation. The cardiac catheterization revealed LAD occlusion severe enough that my cardiologist said maintaining consciousness after the initial onset was unlikely for more than a few minutes. Craig Toleson's assessment, based on my condition when they reached me and the telemetry from the defibrillator they used, was that I had been unconscious for an extended period. He estimated 40 to 50 minutes, based on the rate of decline in my cardiac markers and the body temperature reading they took. And I did not have the physical ability to move 2 deadfall logs off a trail while in that condition. Explanation 2. Someone else was on the property. A hiker, a hunter, someone who came across me and helped. Problems. The property is gated at the forest road. With a combination lock, only Lloyd Breck and I have the combination too. The gate was closed and locked when SAR arrived. They used the combination I'd given the dispatcher. There was no vehicle on the property other than my tractor and my truck. No person came forward afterward to identify themselves as having assisted me, which is an unusual choice for any human being who had just saved someone's life. There were no human footprints in the soft ground around the meadow and the drag track perimeter. Craig Tolson specifically noted the absence of boot prints in his incident report, which I obtained a copy of through a records request to Clearwater County Emergency Services in 2020. Explanation 3. An animal, a bear, could potentially drag a human body. A large black bear, a grizzly bear in grizzly country, might. Problems. The Loxa drainage has black bears but not grizzly bears. The grizzly population in Idaho is in the Selkirks and the Cabinet Yaak ecosystem, several hundred miles north. A black bear could drag a human body, but does not move obstacles off a path before dragging. A bear does not place a cell phone on a rock. A bear does not carry a human to a specific location that turns out to be optimal for helicopter landing. A bear does not produce a drag track 3 feet wide and consistent in direction, because a bear dragging something moves in an irregular pattern and the dragged object would leave a chaotic impression, not the straight line track from the tree line to the body that Craig described. When I'd worked through all of that by myself in the first week at home, I drove to Kuskia and I called Craig Tollison and I asked him the question directly. I said, "Given everything your team found at the scene, including the drag track and the placement of the phone, do you have a working explanation for how I got from the splitting area to the meadow?" Craig was quiet for long enough that I thought the cell call had dropped. I was sitting in the Kuskia cafe with a cup of coffee going cold in front of me, watching the elk hunters drive past on their way up toward the Bitterroot. Then he said, "No." He said the incident report he filed listed the transport mechanism as unknown. He said it was not the first time in his years on that SR team that an incident report in that country had listed something as unknown, and it probably wouldn't be the last. I asked him if he'd seen anything, in the air or on the ground, when they arrived. He paused again. Then he said that when the helicopter did the approach to the meadow, the pilot reported something at the tree line on the north side. He described it to Craig as a large dark shape moving into the timber at the edge of the meadow as the helicopter came over. He'd initially thought it was a bear, a large bear moving away from the sound of the rotors. Bears do move away from helicopter sound, but bears move away in a panicked scramble, not a deliberate walk. This moved, Craig said the pilot told him, in a way that looked deliberate, not panicked, purposeful, upright, like whatever it was had watched the helicopter come in, established that help had arrived, and then left. The pilot saw something at the tree line of my meadow, moving deliberately into the timber, at approximately the same time SOR was landing to treat a cardiac patient who had been transported 170 yards from the location where he'd lost consciousness. The pilot thought it was a bear. He told Craig he thought it was a bear. But he also said, and this is Craig's wording to me, that the movement was wrong for a bear. Too upright, too measured, like something that had been there for a reason and was leaving when the reason was satisfied. I'm going to pause here, because I want to give you a chance to sit with that before we go further. I sat with it for about 3 months. In January of 2020, I started talking to people. Not broadcasting it. I'm still not someone who broadcasts this kind of thing. But I started looking for people who had experience in the Clearwater drainage. People who had spent enough time in the Selway Bitterroot to have a point of reference. Lloyd Breck was the first person I talked to, and his response surprised me. I'd expected skepticism. Lloyd is a retired civil engineer. He was in the Army Corps of Engineers before he retired to the Loxa. He is not a man given to superstition, and he's not a man who extends trust to unusual claims without evidence. When I told him everything, the log structure, the smell, the vocalization, the silhouette on the ridge, the drag track, the phone on the rock, what the SAR pilot reported, he listened without interrupting, which is not like him. And when I was done, he was quiet for a while. The kind of quiet that in Lloyd means he's working through something, not dismissing it. Then he said, "My father told me a story about this drainage." Lloyd's father, Earl Breck, had lived on the Loxa from 1951 to 1979, when he died of a stroke at the age of 68. He'd been a timber buyer for a mill in Orofino in the 50s and 60s, which meant he'd spent considerable time on foot in the drainages above US 12, including some of the back country above my property that fed into the Selway Bitterroot. He'd known the country when it was worked harder, when the logging roads went further up into the hills and the mill traffic on US 12 was constant. Lloyd said his father had told him once that there was something in those drainages, that the old-timers who worked the timber had a name for it, or a few names, none of which Earl used with Lloyd. He'd just referred to it as the thing in the high country. Earl had said that the men who worked the timber for long enough came to understand that the thing was there, and that it was not something to be frightened of unless you gave it a reason. That there were rules, or at least understandings, that had accumulated over the years through experience. That you didn't work that country after dark if you could avoid it. That you paid attention to when the squirrels went quiet. That you left things as you found them. And that if you spent enough time up there, the thing would, as Earl put it, take your measure. Decide what kind of person you were, and then respond to you accordingly. Lloyd had heard this story once when he was in his 30s at his father's kitchen table during a visit. He'd treated it the way most people treat their parents' old stories, as something regional and probably apocryphal, half folk tale and half embellishment, worth storing but not worth verifying. He'd never gone looking for more context. He'd lived on the Lochsa for 40 years and not had any experiences he couldn't explain, and so he'd let the story stay in its drawer. Now, sitting in his kitchen in January, with my second cup of coffee getting cold in front of me, he told me he was taking it out of the drawer. He said, "I think whatever your father talked about, whatever the old timber boys called it, I think it took your measure and decided you were worth keeping. And I think it knew exactly what it was doing." That's Lloyd Breck's interpretation, not mine. I'm not asking you to accept it. I'm not sure I fully accept it myself. But I haven't been able to come up with one that works better. What I can tell you is what happened in the months after. In the spring of 2020, once the snow was off the ground, and I'd been cleared by my cardiologist to resume physical activity at a graduated pace, I went back up to the northeast ridge. I was careful. I went up with my phone charged, and with a satellite communicator, a Garmin InReach Mini, which I'd bought in the hospital from the online store on my laptop, lying in the ICU bed, because it turns out almost dying tends to clarify your opinions about emergency preparedness. The InReach sends an SOS signal with GPS coordinates regardless of cell coverage, directly to the GEO's International Emergency Response Coordination Center. A dedicated device for that purpose, not a phone call that requires 1 bar of Verizon service. I went up in good light in the morning, and I told Lloyd where I was going and what time he should expect me back. There was no log structure, there were no new tracks, no new structures, nothing dramatic. What there was a smell. That same smell present at the upper edge of the draw, present and then gone after about 20 minutes, like something had moved through the area recently and its passage still hung in the air. And later, when I was heading back down, on the sorting wall at the edge of the splitting area, there was something I hadn't put there. A bundle of ponderosa pine boughs, broken clean and laid together, maybe 8 inches long, bound around the middle with a strip of inner bark twisted into a cord, laid on top of the sorting wall, on the flat face of the top round. I hadn't passed that wall on the way up. I'd gone up the slope on the far side and come down through the timber, not through the splitting area. The bundle was there when I came back down. I hadn't put it there. Lloyd had not been up to the property. No one had been up to the property. I took a photograph and I left it where it was. When I went back up 3 days later, it was gone. I've been thinking for months about how to describe what I believe is happening on this property. I've resisted the framing that a lot of people want to put on this kind of thing, the idea that what I've described is either a hoax or an impossibility, that it has to be one or the other. I'm not a person who fabricates stories. I have no reason to fabricate this one. The incident report from Clearwater County Emergency Services is a public document. The stent in my LAD is a physical fact. The drag track in the meadow grass is something that Craig Tolleson, a professional paramedic with 18 years of SAR experience, observed and documented and has no explanation for. I'm also not someone who reaches for dramatic conclusions before the evidence gets there. I don't know what was on this property in 2019. I know what I found and what happened and what other people observed. I know that something moved me, 170 yards through timber while I was unconscious and placed my phone where it would transmit coordinates and be found. I know that the logs on the path had been moved. I know that the SAR pilot saw something at the tree line that moved in a way he said was wrong for a bear. I've talked to people who've spent time in the Selway Bitterroot, Forest Service workers and backcountry guides, and one retired wildlife biologist who asked me not to use his name. Every one of them, without exception, had something to tell me about the high country up there. Not dramatic things, not most of them. Sounds they couldn't account for. Structures they found that didn't fit the landscape. Instances where their horses or their dogs would not go further on a trail for no apparent reason. And the way the experienced animals always reacted the same way. Not panic, but refusal. A definitive refusal, like an animal that knows what it knows and is not going to argue about it. One of those conversations was with a man I'll call Denny, because he asked me to keep it that way. Denny is a backcountry horse outfitter out of Lowell, Idaho, which is about 30 miles west of my property on US 12. He's been running pack strings into the Selway Bitterroot for 22 years. He told me about an incident in the fall of 2016 on the Selway River Trail above the Moose Creek airstrip, where his entire pack string, 7 horses, stopped simultaneously on a section of trail and refused to go forward. Not spooked, not shying. Stopped, heads up, ears forward, and would not take a step. Denny had been packing into that long enough that he got off his horse and walked up the trail 50 yards, alone, to see what was there. He didn't find anything on the trail, but he told me that when he walked back to the horses, there was a smell in the air that he'd never smelled in that country before. Animal, he said, heavy and warm, and not quite like anything he knew. And in the timber above the trail, about 80 yards up the slope, the trees were moving. Not in the wind, it was a still afternoon. Something was in there moving through the trees, and whatever it was moving parallel to the trail in the same direction he was traveling, and it was big. Not crashing through the brush the way a deer or an elk would, moving purposefully, like it was keeping pace. Denny went back to his horses, turned the string around, and made camp 2 miles back at a flat he knew. He'd been in that country 22 years, and that was the first time he'd ever turned a string around on that trail. He said the sound of whatever was moving in those trees stayed with him for maybe a quarter of a mile before it stopped, and then the horses settled and walked normally, and he made camp, and nothing else happened that night. In the morning he went back up the trail and found the same section where the horses had refused, and on the slope above the trail there was a line through the undergrowth where something had moved, bent stalks, pressed brush, running parallel to the trail for about 60 yards, and then stopping at the base of a large cedar, where the ground was soft. No clear track at the cedar, he said. The ground was soft enough that anything of real weight should have left a print. There was the depression in the ground at the base of the cedar, smooth and bowl-shaped, like something had stood there for a while, but no defined toe or heel impressions, just compressed ground. He'd never reported it. He'd never told a client. He told me he'd told his wife, and his wife had told him that the old Nez Perce name for that drainage translated roughly to the country that keeps watch, and that he should consider himself lucky that whatever was up there had decided his string wasn't worth its attention that day. I found that phrase useful, the country that keeps watch, because it captures something about the quality of what I've experienced on this property that I hadn't been able to put into my own words. The sense that you are known, not just observed. That there is awareness on the other end of whatever exchange is happening. The same way there's awareness on both sides of a conversation. I don't know what to do with that awareness. I don't know what it wants or what I owe it. I'm not sure those are even the right questions. What I know is that I am alive, and that I shouldn't be, and that the reason I'm alive is something I cannot explain with any tool I have. Something carried me to a place where I could be found and helped. Something placed my phone where it could do the most good. Something moved the obstacles off the path before carrying me through. And something, or someone, I think someone is probably the closer word, though I say it carefully, watched until help arrived and then went back into the timber. That's where we are when we get to the end of what I thought this story was about. Because it's not over. The fall of 2020 brought new things, and the winter of 2020 into 2021 brought things I wasn't ready for. And by the spring of 2021, I understood that what had happened in October of 2019 was not a single event that I could close a cover on and file away. It was the beginning of something that I still don't fully understand the shape of. Let me pick up where I left off, which is the fall of 2020, a year after the cardiac event. I'd had 12 months to think about what happened and to talk, carefully and selectively, to people I trusted. I'd done my own version of research, not the online kind, mostly, though I read some of the documented accounts that have been put together by people who take this subject seriously. More importantly, I'd spent 12 months on this property, paying attention in a way I hadn't before 2019, paying attention to the patterns, trying to understand what the patterns meant. I want to tell you about the fall of 2020 in sequence because the sequence matters. The first week of September, I went up to the Northeast Ridge to scout my timber again, same as every year. I'd talked with my cardiologist, and she'd cleared me for full physical work, as long as I was building up gradually. No single-day pushing. Take breaks when I needed them. Eat before I started, rather than waiting until I was already feeling it. I had the inReach on my belt every time I went up the hill. I had my phone charged and in my breast pocket. I had a protocol with Lloyd Breck. I'd text him when I went up and when I came back down. And if he didn't hear from me by a specific time, he'd call the property. And if he couldn't reach me on the phone, he'd drive over. It wasn't a perfect system, but it was better than what I'd had in 2019, which was nothing. On the third day of scouting, I found the first new thing. About 120 yards above the splitting area, on the slope below the Northeast Ridge, there was a section of standing timber that I'd been working toward for 2 years. Big ponderosa snags, 6 of them that had died in a drought year and were now dry enough to burn clean. Good firewood. I'd marked them in 2019 before everything happened and hadn't gotten to them, because I'd spent most of October in a hospital bed. I'd been planning to get to them in 2020. When I reached that section of the slope, the 6 trees were down. Not fallen, down, felled. The stumps were clean cuts, not wind throw, which leaves a root ball and a shattered base, and not root failure, which leaves a ragged break. Each stump was cut. The cuts were smooth around most of the circumference and then fractured at the final break point, which is exactly what a compression break looks like when something has pushed or bent a standing tree at the base until the remaining wood fibers give way. It's also what you see when a large diameter tree is felled with a traditional pull-and-push method rather than a chainsaw. The compression and tension zones of the wood fail in a characteristic pattern. No sawdust, no machine marks. And the trees had been laid out in a row, parallel, lined up with their butts to the west and their tops to the east, like they'd been organized for something, each tree touching the next along its full length. Tight, deliberate, the way you'd lay timber if you were setting up for a bucking operation. I stood at the edge of that section for a while. I didn't go in immediately. I looked at the row of felled trees for maybe 10 minutes, and then I took photographs and I went back down to the cabin. That evening I texted Lloyd and asked if he had time to come up the next day and look at something. He came up the following morning, and I walked him up to the Northeast Ridge and showed him the trees. Lloyd walked along the row of felled ponderosa, looking at the stumps, and he was quiet for a while. He crouched at the first stump, looked at the cut face, ran his hand across it. He stood up. He went to the next one. He said, "Those aren't machine cuts." Then he said, "Those are laid out." Then he said, "Who did this?" And I said I didn't know. He said, "Do you have an idea?" And I said yes. He nodded. He looked at the stumps again. He walked to the top end of the row and back. He said, "They're the right length for firewood bolts if you buck them." And he was right. The row of felled trees ended at a point where the ground opened up enough that the Kubota could drive alongside it. If I bucked those 6 trees into rounds, the tractor could haul them out in 4 or 5 runs. It was, from a practical standpoint, almost exactly what I would have done if I'd felled them myself. Same orientation, same landing pattern. The only thing missing was the bucking. We drove back down and had coffee. Lloyd didn't say anything more about it for the rest of the morning. When he left, he said, "Be careful up there." Not in a scared way, in the way you say it to someone who's going into country that deserves respect. I bucked those trees over 3 days in late September. 6 ponderosa snags, 100 feet each, bucked into 16-inch rounds, hauled down to the splitting area. It was the largest single haul of firewood I'd done in 10 years on the property, and I didn't have to spend a minute on felling. I had my winter supply almost entirely put up by October 1st, which had never happened before, and I kept thinking, while I worked, about the practical intelligence embedded in what had been done. The trees felled in a position accessible to available equipment, the row oriented for access, the length consistent with what the tractor could transport. This was not random. Whatever had done this had watched me work for years and understood what I was doing and how I did it. That word is the one I keep coming back to, helped. October came and I was not behind on wood. For the first time in 10 years, I had the winter supply in by mid-October with time left over. I spent some of that time sitting on the back porch of the cabin in the evenings, watching the light go off the ridge to the north. 3 times in October, I saw something on the northeast ridge at dusk. Not clearly, the distance is too far for clarity in failing light, and the timber on the ridge face is thick enough that what you see is movement through trees, not a shape in the open, large, dark, upright. Something that moved through the timber on 2 legs, and that paused, briefly, each time I looked up. The 4th evening in October, I went to the back porch and set a thermos of coffee on the railing. I'd thought about it for a couple of days. I set the thermos there open, and I went inside and left the porch light off. An hour later, I went back out. The thermos was on its side. It had been opened, and it was empty. Whatever had approached the porch had tipped the thermos to drink from it. The railing had 2 depressions in the soft wood of the top board, on either side of where the thermos had been, that looked like hand impressions. I couldn't make out individual fingers, but the impressions were large, too large for my hands, and I wear an XL glove, about 11 inches across the spread. That winter was quiet. December and January brought heavy snow up on the ridge, and I spent most of my time close to the cabin. In February, I started to relax a little. Not that I forgot what I knew, but the immediate alertness settled into something lower and more constant. In March of 2021, the snow was off the lower slopes, and I started going up the draw again. The first week of March, I found something at the base of a large western red cedar just above the splitting area. A pile, about 18 inches across, of carefully selected objects. The objects were 3 pieces of elk antler, shed antler, not worked, just laid there. A round stone, smooth about the size of my fist, dark gray granite that I didn't recognize from the local geology. The nearest granite exposure I know of is up near the Bitterroot Crest, well into the wilderness. A bundle of dried vegetation that I later identified by comparing to photographs online, and then confirming with a botanist friend of Lloyd's as dried beargrass. Xerophyllum tenax, bundled and tied with a grass cord. And one other thing that I have not told many people about because I don't know how to frame it. A piece of wood, a section of branch, maybe 8 inches long and 1.5 inches in diameter, peeled clean of bark. And carved into the surface of that piece of wood was an image, not elaborate, not detailed work, simple but recognizable, a horizontal line. Below the horizontal line, a series of short vertical marks, evenly spaced. I counted them, 8. Above the horizontal line, on the left side, a circle. I looked at it for a long time, trying to understand what I was looking at. And then I understood. The horizontal line was the ridge. The short vertical marks below it were trees. The circle above the ridge on the left side, the western side, was the sun. It was a landscape. My landscape. My ridge, viewed from below, from the position of the splitting area. Something had made an image of my property from the vantage point where I spend most of my working hours. I sat on a round at the base of that cedar for a long time, with that piece of wood in my hands. I'm not someone who is easily moved. I'm 63 years old, and I grew up in Boise in the 70s, and I spent 30 years on a lineman's crew, where crying was not a regular feature of the workday. I did not cry, but I sat there for a long time, with that carved piece of wood in my hands, and I felt something that I don't have a clean word for, something more like recognition than gratitude, like being seen by something that had taken the trouble to show you it was seeing you. I carried it inside. It's on my windowsill above the kitchen sink. I look at it every morning when I'm doing dishes. In April of 2021, I contacted a man named Doug Wren, who runs a Bigfoot research organization out of Boise. Doug spent 23 years as a wildlife biologist with Idaho Fish and Game, working primarily in the Clearwater and Salmon River drainages, and he came to this subject through his field experience, not through wanting to believe something, but through encountering something he couldn't explain and taking it seriously enough to investigate. I drove down to Boise and spent an afternoon with him, and what he told me expanded what I understood considerably. Doug told me that the Clearwater drainage and the Selway Bitterroot country have one of the highest rates of serious incident reports in the Northwest. Not campfire stories, not tourist sightings. Reports from people who work in that country, guides, outfitters, Forest Service personnel, wildlife contractors. He'd collected over 300 reports from the Clearwater drainage alone in 20 years of compiling, and he characterized the pattern of what gets reported as consistent with a large, intelligent primate that maintains extensive home ranges and demonstrates behaviors consistent with sustained observation of human activity. The structures, the vocalizations, the response to human presence that appears to involve assessment rather than immediate retreat or aggression. He told me something that I've thought about since. He said that in his experience, the encounters that follow the pattern I'd described, where a person has been on a piece of ground for years, and the encounters begin gradually and escalate incrementally, and the creature demonstrates awareness of the person's individual habits and routines. Those tend to be the most stable situations. Stable is the word he used. He meant that the interactions have a low likelihood of becoming aggressive, because the foundation of them is familiarity rather than surprise. Whatever is on my property has known me for years. It knows my schedule, my routes, my tools, my patterns. That familiarity, Doug said, is protective in both directions. He also said something I want to pass on directly, because it stayed with me. He said that in his view, based on everything he'd studied and experienced, these are not animals in the way we typically use that word. He was careful about what he meant. He wasn't reaching for something outside biology. He was saying that the cognitive architecture required to produce the behaviors that get consistently documented across decades and regions is not consistent with what we call animal cognition. The planning, the tool use, the structure building that follows recognizable architectural logic, the apparent capacity to map human activity and respond to it in ways that account for the human's perspective. He said, "We have a word for that level of cognitive capacity when we find it in something shaped like us. We don't have a good word for it when we find it in something shaped differently." That's what I've been sitting with since April of 2021, not what to call it, but what it means for how I live on this property and what obligations flow out of knowing what I know. I've made some changes, not dramatic ones. I leave a portion of the split wood up at the sorting wall at the end of each day, rather than hauling everything down to the shed, enough for a fire, if someone needed one. I've planted bear grass in a section of the upper slope. I leave the heads standing at the end of summer rather than cutting them. Small things, gestures maybe. I'm not sure what they communicate or whether they communicate anything at all. But they feel right, and I've learned to pay attention to what feels right up there. In the fall of 2021, I started keeping a more detailed log. Not the property notebook, a separate journal, specifically for what I observe in the upper draw and on the northeast ridge. By the time I'm writing this, that journal has 2.5 years of entries. Some of them are mundane, smell present, jays quiet, returned at noon, nothing unusual. Some of them are less mundane. On a Tuesday in October of 2021, I was hauling a load of rounds down to the splitting area on the tractor when I heard the vocalization again. Different from the first two, higher in register, shorter, and it came from below the ridge rather than above it, from the draw itself, closer than anything I'd heard before. I stopped the tractor. The sound was 40, maybe 50 yards north of my position, in the cedar timber near the creek. I sat on the tractor and waited. A second vocalization came about 30 seconds later, same register, same duration, from a position that seemed further east. Two sounds, separated by distance. I had the clear impression of two separate sources, the first close, the second answering from further away. The way two people call out to each other when one needs to confirm where the other is. I sat for a while after the second sound faded. Then I finished the load and went down. In my journal that evening, I wrote, 2 vocalizations, distinct sources, 30-second interval, possible coordinated communication. The entry takes about 6 lines. I've been working this property for 11 years. I know the sounds it makes. I know the Steller's jays and the nutcrackers and the bugling from the elk on the south-facing ridges in October. I know what a great horned owl sounds like at 2 in the morning, and what a barred owl sounds like when it's working the creek. I know the pops and groans of the timber in a temperature change, the sound the creek makes in spring versus fall, the wind sound in the ponderosa versus the wind sound in the cedar. I know this ground the way you know a place after 11 years of close attention. What I heard in October of 2021 was not anything I can put in that catalog. I want to tell you about September of 2022, because it's the most important thing that happened in the second 3 years, and it changed how I think about what's going on here. My daughter Mara came up from Coeur d'Alene for a week. She's 41, she's a physical therapist. She grew up coming to this part of Idaho on fishing trips with me before I bought the property, and she's been up to the cabin a few times since. She's not someone who unsettles easily, and she's not credulous. She hears something that doesn't make sense, and her first move is to find the part that makes sense. She's a good thinker. She'd heard most of the story by then. I'd told her about the cardiac event and the SAR response and the recovery. I hadn't told her about the carved piece of wood or the porch thermos or the felled trees, partly because I wasn't sure how to frame it, and partly because I'd wanted more time before opening those parts of the story to someone else's reaction. She came up in September with the stated intention of seeing the property and having some good fishing on the Loxa, and not thinking about work for a week. I didn't bring any of it up. On the 3rd day she was there, a Thursday, I went up to the splitting area in the morning, and she came with me. The splitting area looks the same now as it did in 2019, more or less. The sorting wall, the tractor, the same patch of timber to the north and east. I showed her the approximate location where I'd been sitting when the cardiac event started, and she stood there quietly for a while. She asked some technical questions about the terrain and the access from the cabin. Then she said, "Which direction is the ridge?" I pointed northeast. She looked that way for a while, looking up through the timber at the ridge face. The timber was thick enough that you couldn't see the ridge from the splitting area. You had to know it was there. Then she said, "There's something up there." I didn't say anything. She said, "I can feel it watching." I said, "I know." She said, "It doesn't feel bad." I said, "No, it doesn't." We stood there for a minute, the two of us, looking up at the northeast ridge through the timber. Then she said, "Okay." And she picked up a round and set it on the splitter platform, which is something I hadn't asked her to do, and we spent the next 2 hours splitting wood together in the morning light with the ridge above us, and the loxa going cold and green below the property. That was a good morning. I think about it often. I want to tell you about last fall, the fall of 2023, because it's the most recent thing and in some ways the hardest to describe. I was up at the splitting area on a Wednesday afternoon in early October, finishing a run of ponderosa rounds, when the squirrels went quiet first. Then the smell. That dense, animal living smell, closer than usual, within 70 yards, maybe closer. I stopped the splitter and stood still with my hands at my sides. This is the protocol I've developed over 4 years. Stop what you're doing. Stand still. Don't make a sudden movement. Don't stare directly at the tree line. Not because I'm afraid, because it's respectful, and because I've learned that respect is read and returned. I stood there for maybe 3 minutes. The smell stayed. The draw was very quiet. And then, from the northeast ridge, from the same place, the vocalization had come that September evening in 2019. There was a sound, different from the first, lower, shorter, not the long falling note. 2 short sounds, deliberate, separated by about 4 seconds, like 2 statements, not a sentence, like someone saying a thing they're sure about. I don't know what it meant. I know I heard it. After a minute, I went back to the splitter and finished the run. The smell faded around 15 minutes later. When I went up to the sorting wall to lay out the day's wood, there was a fresh set of tracks in the soft ground at the base of the wall, not from the northeast side, from the west, from the timber toward the creek. Large oval, pressed deep, 5 toes, the first and second close together, the heel narrow. The stride between them was over 5 feet. I measured before the light went. Each track was 17 inches long by 7.5 inches wide at the forefoot. I set my size 12 Red Wing work boot next to the tracks. The heel of my boot didn't reach the outside edge of the heel impression. I photographed them and went down to the cabin. That night I sat at the kitchen table with the carved piece of wood, the one with the ridge and the trees and the sun, and I thought about what 4 years of this has taught me. Here's what I would tell someone if they asked me directly. Is it safe? I don't know. I think it's conditional. I think it's safer if you pay attention. I think it's safer if you move through the ground with awareness and leave things largely as you find them. I think a person who comes into that country calmly and quietly, who pays attention to the squirrels and the smell and the silence, has less to worry about than they might assume. I think the most dangerous thing you can do in a situation like this is panic. Because panic produces the behaviors that make things worse, sudden movements, loud noise, aggression, and I think whatever is up on that ridge has enough experience with people to know the difference between someone who's paying attention and someone who isn't. What I can tell you is that I am alive, and that I shouldn't be, and that the reason I'm alive is something I cannot explain with any tool I have. Something carried me to a place where I could be found and helped. Something placed my phone where it could do the most good. Something moved the obstacles off the path before carrying me through. And something watched until help arrived, and then went back into the timber. I don't know what I owe for that. I'm not sure owing is the right frame. What I think is that it's an ongoing situation, rather than a settled debt, an ongoing exchange. It's still up there. I still go up to the northeast ridge. I still smell it in the draw some mornings. I still hear things from the ridge on clear evenings when the wind is right. Last month I went up to the sorting wall and found a ponderosa cone placed on top of the highest round. One cone placed neatly on the flat face. I left a piece of deer jerky on the same round when I went back the next day. The next morning the jerky was gone and the cone was still there. I don't know what that exchange is. I know that it is one. People ask me if I'm going to sell the property. I'm not. I'm going to keep cutting wood and going up the northeast ridge and sitting on the back porch in October evenings when the light is good and the ridge is going to shadow. I'm going to keep the inReach on my belt and stick to the check-in protocol with Lloyd and take the daily aspirin my cardiologist tells me to take. And I have something on the northeast ridge that I can't explain and that saved my life and that I expect to share this ground with for whatever years I have left on it. That's where things stand. That's the whole story, as honest as I can tell it. If you've had an experience in the Clearwater Country, or in the Selway Bitterroot, or anywhere in that Loxa drainage, I'd be glad to hear about it. What I think is that there are people all over this country with pieces of this, and the pieces are worth putting together carefully, without rushing to conclusions that the evidence doesn't actually support. Take care of yourselves out there. Pay attention to the squirrels. And if the draw goes quiet and the smell comes, stand still. That's usually the right thing to do. I've been going back through my notes since I started putting this story together, and there are things I left out earlier that I want to come back to now, because they fill in gaps that matter. Let me tell you more about the property itself, because the geography is important. The Loxa River in Clearwater County runs through one of the deepest canyons in Idaho, following a corridor that the Lewis and Clark expedition came through in September of 1805, when they nearly starved to death trying to cross the Bitterroot Mountains before the weather closed the passes. The Nez Perce had lived in this drainage for thousands of years. They knew this country in a way that the Corps of Discovery didn't, and they helped Lewis and Clark survive a crossing that would otherwise have killed them. The Nez Perce also had a name for the things in the high country. I didn't know this when I bought the property, and I didn't learn it until my second conversation with Doug Wren in the fall of 2021 when he shared some of what he'd gathered from conversations with tribal members who were willing to talk about it. The Nez Perce name for what I've been encountering, and I want to be careful here, because I don't want to flatten or misrepresent a tradition I don't fully understand, translates most directly as something like the Watchers, not a malevolent term, not a term that implies danger, a term that acknowledges presence and awareness. The old understanding in that tradition, as Doug conveyed it to me, and as I'm conveying it to you with the caveat that I'm twice removed from the source, was that the Watchers were not separate from the land. They were part of it in the way that the cedar trees and the creek and the winter snowpack were part of it. Not animals in the sense I understood the word. Not people in the sense I understood that word either. Something that didn't have an easy category in the Nez Perce system any more than it has an easy category in mine. And the traditional understanding was that people who spent time in the high country and who treated the ground with respect were not in danger from them. People who didn't, who were wasteful or loud, or who took more than they needed, or who broke the ground in ways that didn't need to be broken, those people had a different experience. I've thought about that a lot in the context of what I've spent 11 years doing on this property. I heat with wood. I cut what I need, and I don't cut more. I don't run cattle. I don't develop the upper slope. I don't build roads into the timber. I maintain the property at a scale consistent with the kind of life I want to live, which is a quiet one, with not much traffic and not much noise. I don't know if any of that matters to what's on the northeast ridge. I don't know if there's any mechanism by which how I use the land affects how I'm perceived by whatever perceives it, but I know that Lloyd Breck's father, Earl, said that the thing in the high country took your measure, decided what kind of person you were. And I think the way a person uses a piece of land over years is probably one of the most legible things about them to anything that's been watching long enough. I want to tell you about something that happened in the summer of 2019, before the cardiac event, that I've thought about in retrospect as significant. At the time it didn't register. I've gone back to it many times since. In June of 2019, I had a mule deer doe show up in the lower meadow with a fawn. This is not unusual. The meadow is good deer habitat, grassy and open with cover at the edges, and I usually see deer in it 2 or 3 times a week in summer. But this doe was different from the start. She was young, probably a yearling that had fawned for the first time, and the fawn was very small, maybe 2 or 3 days old, still wobbly on its legs, staying tight to the doe's side. I watched them from the porch and thought nothing of it. What I thought about later was what I saw on the 3rd morning they were in the meadow. I went out to the porch early, before full light, with my first cup of coffee, and the doe and fawn were in the meadow as usual. But there was something else at the north edge of the meadow, at the tree line. A dark shape, large, upright, standing very still at the edge of the timber, watching the doe and fawn in the meadow. I saw it for maybe 20 seconds before the light changed, and it was gone. It didn't run. It didn't move dramatically. It simply receded into the trees the way a shadow recedes when the light shifts. But for those 20 seconds, I saw it clearly enough to know it was not a bear. Too tall, too upright, too still. It stood the way a person stands when they're watching something they find interesting, not stalking, watching. The doe was not frightened. She was aware of it. She raised her head twice and looked toward the tree line, but she didn't bolt and she didn't flag her tail, which is what deer do when they've identified a real threat. She looked, and she lowered her head and kept grazing. The fawn, oblivious, kept nursing. And the thing at the tree line stood there and watched, and then was gone. I wrote that in the property notebook the same morning, June 11th, 2019, 4 months before the cardiac event. Looking at it now in context, I think that was the beginning of something that I was too busy to notice. After the cardiac event and my recovery, I spent considerable time reconstructing the timeline of what I could document from the notebook and from my own memory. The log structure in August, the smell starting in early September, the vocalization on September 11th, the silhouette on the ridge on September 28th, and before all of that, the dark shape at the meadow tree line. On June 11th, watching the doe and fawn, the property had been watched for months before October 14th. Whatever decision was made on that morning, it hadn't been made quickly. My cardiologist, Dr. Anisha Patel at St. Mary's in Grangeville, told me at my 1-year follow-up that my recovery was exceptional. Her word, exceptional. She said my cardiac function, measured by echocardiogram, had returned to 92% of what would be expected for a man my age without any cardiac history, which is better than most LAD occlusion survivors get back, even with optimal treatment and compliance. She said the rapidity of the stent placement, 90 minutes from the 911 call to the catheterization lab, was the main factor in the outcome. She said that every 10 minutes of additional ischemia time past the first 60 would have cost me an additional percentage of permanent cardiac function. She said the GPS coordinates transmitted to the dispatcher during the call were what made the 90-minute time achievable. She didn't ask me how my phone came to be placed on a rock in the meadow transmitting those coordinates. She didn't need to know. For her purposes, the relevant fact was the outcome, and the outcome was good. I sat across from her in her exam room, with the echocardiogram report on her desk between us, and thought about the rock in the meadow and the phone and the drag track in the grass. And I said, I was lucky. She said, you were very lucky. I agreed with her. I just didn't entirely mean the same thing she meant. I want to tell you about the month I spent in the cabin between October 24th and Thanksgiving that year, when I was home from the hospital but not yet cleared for physical work. 10 days of restricted activity, then 6 weeks of graduated return to activity, which for a man whose life involves physical work means 6 weeks of sitting and watching and going slowly, crazy by degrees. I read. I watched the ridge. I wrote in the property notebook more than I'd written in it in 10 years combined. The first week back, the weather turned. An early season snowfall on October 28th, 6 inches in the lower drainage and probably a foot or more on the northeast ridge. I couldn't go up the hill, couldn't do anything on the property except walk to the woodshed and back and manage the fire. I sat at the kitchen table every morning with my coffee and looked out the north-facing window at the ridge. The snow made things visible in ways that the summer growth didn't. You could see the lines of timber on the ridge crest against the gray sky, and you could see the open faces between the timber columns, and on a clear morning, you could see the glint of light on snow through the tree gaps. On the 4th day, after the snowfall, November 1st, I was sitting at the table at 8 in the morning with coffee. Clear day, cold, probably 15 degrees at night, and not much warmer than 20 by 8 in the morning. The ridge was white above the tree line, and the timber below it was dark and still. I was looking at it idly, not with any particular expectation, the way you look at a view you've looked at 10,000 times before. And I saw movement, not subtle movement, not the kind I'd been noticing for months where you could argue with yourself about what you'd seen. Clear, deliberate movement on the open face of the ridge, above the tree line, maybe 450 yards from where I was sitting. Something was moving across the snow. Walking, on 2 legs, upright, a dark figure against the white field, moving east to west across the ridge line. It was large enough that I could see its proportions clearly even at that distance. The arms hung low. The stride was long, covering ground steadily. It moved through a section of open snow maybe 60 yards wide, visible the whole way, and then entered the timber on the west end and was gone. I sat there with my coffee cup halfway to my mouth for a while. Then I got up and got my binoculars. I keep a pair of 10's X42 Vortex Diamondbacks on the hook by the north window for exactly this purpose, for watching the ridge when the weather's good. I put them on the spot where the figure had crossed. The snow was still and undisturbed where the timber had swallowed it, but in the open section I could see, even at that distance and through the binoculars, the line of tracks in the snow. A walking line, wide-spaced, bipedal. Not the tight parallel line of an elk trot, not the alternating gallop pattern of a predator moving at speed. A walking line, with the left and right impressions placed wide apart, and the stride interval that I'd come to know from the tracks I'd found at the sorting wall. I watched that spot for another hour. Nothing else crossed the open face. I went back to my coffee, which was cold by then, and I sat there, and I thought about the last 3 weeks, and about what Craig Tollison had told me, and about the drag track in the meadow grass, and about the thing I'd seen on the ridge on September 28th. I thought about the shape walking through the snow on the ridge above my cabin on a clear November morning, 450 yards out in plain daylight. Not hiding, moving in the open, visible. I think about that deliberately. The visibility of it. Whatever I've been dealing with has no trouble being invisible in timber or brush. It's demonstrated that over and over. When it's close to my work zone in the draw, I don't see it. I smell it sometimes. I hear it sometimes. But I don't see it. The one time I saw it clearly was September 28th, and that was a stationary sighting on a ridgeline. It was standing still, and it was standing where it could be seen. The November 1st crossing was the same. It was walking across open ground in full daylight in a way that, at 450 yards, was visible from my kitchen window. I don't think those were accidents. I think whatever was doing that knew it was visible, and chose to be visible, and chose the degree of visible it wanted to be. Far enough that I couldn't make out detail, close enough and open enough that there was no question what I was seeing. That's not animal behavior. A prey animal moves through cover. A predator moves through cover. Something that is neither prey nor predator, something that has its own reasons for what it does, might move through open ground on purpose, at a distance calculated to be clear but not close. I'm aware of how that sounds. I'm aware it sounds like I'm attributing a level of social awareness and deliberate communication to something that the scientific establishment would have a lot of trouble with. I'm telling you what I observed. Over the winter of 2019 into 2020, I was inside a lot. I went through my notes. I made calls. I read. One of the things I read was an account by a woman named Tina Sherrill, who spent 3 years doing informal research on encounters in the Clearwater drainage and published her findings through a small press in Lewiston in 2018. The book is called High Country, and it's not a sensational book. It's methodical, organized by year and county, drawing on direct interviews with people who'd had experiences in the area. I found it at the Kuskia Library, of all places, in the local interest section. I read it twice. What struck me about Sherrill's collection was the consistency of the pattern across unrelated accounts, spanning 4 decades. Smell first. Then the silence, the squirrels and birds going quiet. Then occasionally a vocalization, described in terms that all converged on the same qualities: low frequency, structured, unlike any identified wildlife. Then, if the person spent enough time in the area, structures, stick formations, log arrangements, items placed, and then, in a smaller subset of accounts, direct sighting. Not all accounts ended at sighting. Most people left after the smell and silence stage, before anything happened that couldn't be rationalized. The ones who stayed, who worked the same ground year after year, had different experiences, more prolonged, more specific. My account followed that pattern exactly, from the early stage indicators in the summer and fall of 2019 all the way through the events of October 14th and into the prolonged contact period that followed. I wasn't aware of Sherrill's book when any of it was happening. I wasn't fitting my experience to a template. The fit is coming afterward, when I look back and line things up. That's worth noting, I think, because people sometimes assume that accounts like mine are shaped by what the person expected to happen. I wasn't expecting any of this. I spent my entire working life in the trades, in a culture with zero tolerance for this kind of story. I would have actively preferred a different explanation for any of it, and I looked for one. I didn't find one. There's a detail from Craig Tollison's account that I haven't mentioned yet, because I wanted to save it for the right place. And this is the right place. When Craig's crew arrived in the meadow and stabilized me, they did a rapid assessment while prepping for transport. Standard protocols: airway, breathing, circulation, level of consciousness, vital signs. Craig told me at our second meeting that he almost didn't mention one thing he'd noticed because he didn't know how to contextualize it, and in the end he didn't include it in the official incident report, but he told me about it in person. When he was assessing me in the meadow, he looked at my hands. Standard trauma assessment includes hands. You're looking for defensive wounds, abrasions, anything that tells you what happened. My hands were clean. No abrasions, no bark or debris under the nails, nothing that would indicate I'd tried to break a fall or drag myself across the ground. If I'd crawled from the splitting area to the meadow, there would have been dirt under my nails and likely skin damage on the palms. There was nothing. My hands looked the same as if I'd been sitting in a chair. But my coat, the Carhartt canvas coat I'd been wearing, had material on the back that was consistent with being dragged, not dirt, not soil. Organic material, crushed grass, and what Craig described as fine debris, like the kind of material you'd pick up if something large had moved through grass while carrying you. The pattern of it was on the upper back, and the back of the shoulders, and the back of the thighs, which is the distribution you'd expect if someone had been carrying a person in a horizontal or semi-horizontal position, with the back and legs in contact with whatever was doing the carrying. Craig noticed this. He processed it silently and moved on, because his job was to get me into the helicopter and to the catheterization lab, not to answer questions about the physics of my transport. But he filed it away, and he told me about it 6 months later over coffee in Kuskia, and he said, "I've been doing SR for 18 years, and I've seen people after accidents of every kind, and I've never seen a distribution of contact material like that on a patient who was supposedly found lying where they fell. The coat is in my closet. I haven't washed it. I'm not sure why. Some part of me doesn't want to." After I talked to Doug Wren in April of 2021, I spent some time thinking about what he'd said about stable interactions. He'd described my situation as one of the more benign documented cases in his files. A long-term residential presence in an area with an established population, incremental escalation of contact, no aggression, evidence of what he called deliberate positive interaction. He said he'd worked with about a dozen accounts that had that character, and in every one of them the human had spent years on the same ground before the contact began, and the contact had started with small observational evidence, structures, sounds, before escalating to anything more direct. He'd also said something that I want to be honest about, because it was sobering. He said that the cases he was most uncertain about were the ones that involved extended positive contact, because in his experience those cases sometimes changed. Not always, not most of the time. But sometimes a situation that had been stable for years shifted, and the shift was usually associated with some disruption to the pattern, a new person introduced to the property, a change in land use, sometimes just the passage of time, bringing new individuals into the territory with different histories and different assessments. He said, "What you have right now sounds good. Keep doing what you're doing. Don't assume it's permanent." I think about that regularly, not with fear exactly, with the kind of attention that a person gives to a situation they understand is conditional. I'm in my 4th year of this since the cardiac event, and the situation has been stable. The contact has been consistent without escalating past the level it reached in 2020 and 2021. Nothing new has happened in the last year that I'd characterize as a departure from the pattern. But I hold Doug's caution in mind, because I think it's the right way to hold it. There's one more thing I want to say, and then I want to close this out. I am a person who was born and raised in Idaho, who has lived in Idaho his whole life, who worked an outdoor trade for 31 years, and who has now lived alone on 42 acres of backcountry timber land for 11 years. I am not a credulous person. I am not someone who came to this looking for something to believe in. I am someone who had a set of experiences, documented them as carefully as I could, looked for the most plausible explanation for them, and arrived where I arrived because there wasn't a more plausible explanation available. What I believe is that there is a population of large, intelligent, non-human primates in the Selway Bitterroot country, and the drainages feeding into it from the west, including the Loxa drainage where my property sits. I believe they've been there for a very long time. I believe they are more cognitively complex than anything in the documented primate literature, because what I've experienced and what other people in that country have experienced consistently across decades of documented accounts requires a level of social intelligence and environmental awareness that goes past what any described primate demonstrates. I believe one of them saved my life on October 14th, 2019. I can't prove any of that. The photographs I have are inadequate. The tracks I documented are real but interpretable. The incident report is a public document, but it doesn't prove what carried me to the meadow. The carved piece of wood on my windowsill is evidence of something, but the something is ambiguous. I can't prove any of it. I'm telling you what I know because I think it matters that people who have these experiences tell them to other people, honestly, without embellishment, and I'm trying to do that. That's the whole story. All of it. 11 years of property history and 4 years of what I'll call active relationship, for lack of a better term, with something that lives in the high country above the Loxa, and that apparently decided one Monday morning in October of 2019 that I was worth keeping around. I'm grateful for that decision. I try to be worth it. One last thing. My daughter Mara called me last week from Coeur d'Alene. She asked how the property was, how the wood was coming in, whether I'd gotten the gutters cleaned out before the first rain. Normal stuff. At the end of the call, she said, "Have you seen anything up on the ridge lately?" I said, "Last week, I went up to the sorting wall and found a ponderosa cone on the top round." She said, "Did you leave anything back?" I said I'd left a piece of jerky. She said, "What happened to it?" I said, "Gone by morning." She was quiet for a second. Then she said, "That seems right." And I said, "Yes, that's what I said. That seems right." I want to go back to the fall of 2019 one more time, because there are things from those weeks before October 14th that I described briefly, but didn't give enough space to. Things that, in hindsight, were not as minor as I treated them at the time. When I went up to the northeast ridge in those weeks in September and early October, I was focused on the work. That's what I do. I go up the hill to cut and haul, and I focus on the work, because the work requires attention, and the consequence of not paying attention in chainsaw work is a hospital stay. And given what eventually happened to me that fall, the irony of that is not lost on me. But focus on the work meant I was paying less attention to everything around me than I would have been if I'd gone up there with no particular task. I noticed the quiet patches. I noticed the smell. I noticed the vocalization on September 11th. What I didn't notice, or rather what I noticed in passing without giving it the weight it deserved, were the things that were closer to the work itself. In the second week of September, I was bucking a dead ponderosa that I'd dropped a few days earlier. Big tree, probably 80 feet when it was standing, well-aged snag. I was working my way up the trunk from the base, making 16-inch rounds. The saw was loud enough that I was wearing my hearing protection, the Peltor earmuffs I've used for years. When I'm in the earmuffs, all I hear is the saw at close range and the vibration of the work, and everything else, wind, birds, ambient sound, gets cut down to nearly nothing. I was in that mode, focused on the cut, when I took a break to clear sawdust from the chain. I pulled the earmuffs off, and I heard something that I hadn't noticed because the saw had been running. Footsteps, not my footsteps. I was standing still, not deer footsteps, which are light and quick and have a particular rhythm on dry ground. These were heavy, slow, deliberate, moving through the timber about 40 yards to my north. One step, then silence. Another step, 10 or 15 seconds later, a stop. Then another step. The cadence of something moving slowly and carefully, the way something moves when it is trying not to be heard, or when it is carrying something heavy, or both. I stood for maybe 2 minutes with the earmuffs in my hand, listening. The footsteps continued moving east, very slowly, and then stopped. Then there was silence for a long time, and I put the earmuffs back on and finished the cut. I wrote it in the notebook that evening. Slow footsteps in north timber, heavy, deliberate, approximately 40 yards, approximately 8-10-minute duration before stopping. Not identifiable as known wildlife pattern. Looking at that entry now, I'm struck by how calmly I wrote it. I was calm. The footsteps hadn't frightened me. They'd interested me. I think that's significant. I've thought about it a lot since, about why the encounters I had in September of 2019 didn't produce a fear response in me, the way they probably would have in many people. Part of it is temperament. I'm not someone who frightens easily, and I've spent enough time in the backcountry that unusual sounds and evidence get processed as information first and threat second. Part of it, I think now, is the quality of the encounters. There was nothing aggressive in any of what I was experiencing. The smell was close, but it wasn't accompanied by sound or movement that suggested an approach. The footsteps were retreating, not advancing. The vocalization on September 11th was not aimed at me. It was a sound that happened in the draw while I was there, and it didn't repeat when I went down the hill. And the silhouette on the ridge on September 28th stood and watched and then walked away. None of it came at me. It was all alongside or above me or at a distance. Observational. I've talked to enough people since who've had encounters that went differently, that involved what they described as a feeling of threat, of being crowded or followed aggressively, of sounds that were clearly aimed at driving them out rather than just happening in their presence. That I've come to believe the quality of that observational without threat presence was deliberate. Whatever was up there in September was making itself known without pushing. It was doing the thing that Lloyd's father had described, taking measure, working out what I was, and what it decided, apparently, was something that led to what happened on October 14th. I've also gone back to think about the structure I found in late August, the log stack that disappeared and left the foot impressions in the soil. I've wondered since whether that was the beginning of a test, not a hostile test, a test the way you test something you're curious about. You put a thing in someone's space and you watch what they do. You see if they take it, if they dismantle it, if they report it to someone, if they leave it alone. I left it alone. I went back and took photographs, and I went home, and I didn't do anything about it. 3 days later, the structure was moved, and what replaced it was 2-foot impressions in the soil, evidence that didn't try to be invisible. Evidence that, if you were inclined to look, told you clearly that what had made the structure was something that stood on 2 feet and was large. I have wondered since whether that was the next step in the same test, seeing if I'd recognize what the impressions were, seeing what I'd do with that recognition. What I did was take more photographs and go home and not tell anyone. That fall, in the weeks between the silhouette on the ridge and October 14th, I noticed one other thing that I've thought about extensively in the years since. In the splitting area, at the end of several of my working days, the round count was off. Not dramatically, by 1 or 2 rounds each time, but consistent in a specific direction. I was ending each day with fewer rounds in the splitting area than I'd put there. The rounds didn't disappear. When I went back up the next morning, they were there. But occasionally, at the end of a long splitting day, when I was loading the last of what I'd done that day onto the tractor for the haul down, I'd notice that the area behind the sorting wall, the staging area where I stacked finished rounds before loading, had fewer rounds than I thought I'd put there. At the time, I attributed this to fatigue-induced miscounting. I was working long hours in cold weather. I was tired by afternoon, and fatigue does things to your sense of quantity. But I've thought about it since, and I think it's possible that what I was seeing was the beginning of what happened in 2020, when the trees were felled and laid in a row, something that was watching me work, paying attention to what I was doing with the wood, and starting to learn the process. I said earlier that the thing on the northeast ridge helped me. I mean that literally. It felled 6 ponderosa snags in 2020 and laid them in a row for me to buck. It cleared the obstacles off the path on October 14th so it could carry me down. It set my phone on a rock in a location that maximized the usefulness of the GPS coordinates. All of that is help, practical and specific. But I've come to think it was also learning, across a longer period of time, what helping me would look like. Watching me split wood for years, understanding what the process was and what it produced, learning the workflow well enough that when it came time to help, it could do it in a way I'd recognize as help rather than interference. That's a degree of situational learning and social modeling that I can't explain with any framework I have for animal cognition. It's not what bears do. It's not what any primate in any documented study does. It's what people do. We observe, we model the other person's needs and capabilities, and when we help in a way calculated to fit their situation. Whatever is on the northeast ridge did that. It did it with wood. It did it with a clearance path. It did it with a phone placed on a rock in a meadow. It helped me in ways that required it to understand my situation, my tools, my limitations, and what would be most useful to someone in my specific condition. Let me tell you about one more conversation, because it's relevant, and I should have included it earlier. In February of 2020, about 3 months after the cardiac event, and 2 months before I went back up to the Northeast Ridge, I drove down to Grangeville for a follow-up appointment with Dr. Patel. After the appointment, I stopped for lunch at a diner on Main Street that I've been going to for years. The owner, a man named Rex Hollowell, has been running the place since his father died in the 90s. Rex is in his late 50s, grew up in Grangeville, knows everyone in the valley and most of the people up in the timber country. He came over to my table to talk, the way he always does, and asked how I was doing after the heart thing, and I said I was getting better. We talked for a while. Then I told him where I was coming from and going back, the property up off US 12 in the Loxa country, and Rex nodded. He said, "That's up near the old Holstad place." I said it was the old Holstad place. I'd bought it from Holstad's son in 2009. Rex said, "Ivar Holstad." I knew him a little. Old man when I was young. He didn't like talking about what was up on that ridge above his place. I sat very still and asked him what he meant. Rex said, "Ivar had a reputation for not finishing stories. He'd start telling you about something that happened up on his hill, and then he'd trail off and say he wasn't going to talk about it. My dad knew him better than I did. Dad said Ivar had seen something up there early on when he first built the cabin, something he never described, but that changed how he talked about that piece of ground. Dad said Ivar used to tell people who asked about buying the property that the land came with a tenant. He said it like he was joking, but Dad didn't think he was joking." Rex looked at me for a moment. He said, "You've seen something up there, haven't you?" I said, "Yes." He said, "That's Ivar Holstad's property. I figured it would be." He went back to the kitchen. I sat there and thought about the fact that the cabin was built in 1952, and Holstad had lived there for nearly 60 years before his son sold the property after the old man died. 60 years of living on that piece of ground before I bought it. 60 years of knowing what was up on the ridge. The land came with a tenant. That's how he put it. Not threatening, not sinister. A tenant. Something with a claim on the ground that predated his own claim by a long margin. I've thought about what Holstad might have understood about that relationship. Whether he'd reached a similar kind of accommodation, a similar kind of ongoing exchange with whatever is up there. Whether the winter wood for 60 years of a man's life on that property had occasionally been helped along in ways that he noticed and didn't explain to outsiders. Whether Ivar Holstad had sat on his porch in October evenings and watched the Northeast Ridge go to shadow the way I watch it now. I wish I could ask him. I can't. He died in 2007, 2 years before I bought the property. His son, Mick, who sold me the place, lives in Boise now and has no interest in the land or in talking about it. When I closed on the property in 2009, Mick shook my hand and said good luck and left. He didn't say anything about a tenant. Maybe he didn't know. Maybe he did, and thought it was none of his business to say. Either way, what Rex told me in that diner in February of 2020 confirmed something I'd been wondering about for months, that I wasn't the first person to live on that ground in close relationship with whatever lives above it, that Holstad had been there before me for 60 years, and that the relationship had apparently gone well enough that he stayed. That's reassuring in its way. A 60-year tenancy without incident suggests a level of stability that I don't need to be anxious about disrupting with my own 11 years. One thing that happened in the spring of 2022 that I haven't mentioned. I drove up to the property on a Saturday morning in late April and found something on the sorting wall that I'd never found before. Not a bundle of boughs, not a carved piece of wood, not tracks. A fresh elk hide, folded, laid neatly on top of the sorting wall, not the whole hide, a section, maybe 3 feet by 2 feet, with the fur still attached. The fur was clean and undamaged, like it had been skinned carefully. There were no other remains anywhere near the splitting area, no bone, no blood, nothing that would indicate a kill site. Just the hide section, folded, placed on the sorting wall in the morning. I left it there. I don't touch things left up there. I photograph them and leave them. When I went back up 3 days later, the hide was gone. Something had retrieved it. I've turned that over in my mind a lot. What was that? Was it an offering of some kind? A demonstration? Something left by mistake and then retrieved when the mistake was noticed? I don't know. What I know is that the care with which it was placed, folded, clean, set on a flat surface, was the same care I'd observed in everything else. Not careless, deliberate. The wildlife biologist I mentioned, the retired Idaho fish, and game man who asked me not to use his name, had an interesting response when I described the hide. He said that elk hides, specifically, have been found in association with Bigfoot activity in the Pacific Northwest, going back to the earliest documented reports in the 20th century. Hide caches, sometimes, bones sorted and stacked, evidence that the harvest of elk was systematic and organized, not the opportunistic feeding of a predator. He said that the physical evidence across many decades and many locations suggested an organized approach to large game harvest that implied coordination, planning, and the ability to transport entire animals over long distances of rough terrain. He said, if you think of them as hunters who've been working this country for 10,000 years, the behavior makes a lot more sense than if you think of them as animals. Hunters know their territory. They know their game animals. They have methods and routines, and occasionally those methods involve caching, sharing, and managing resources over time, rather than consuming them immediately. That framework, hunters working a territory over long time scales, has helped me make sense of more than just the elk hide. The log structure in August of 2019, the 8 peeled logs interlocked in corners, that's construction behavior, but it's also the behavior of something that understands timber, that works with wood as a material, something that has been in timber country long enough to know what timber is for and how to work it. The felling of the 6 ponderosa snags in 2020, laid in a row for me to buck. That's not just helpful. That's the behavior of something that understands the workflow of wood harvest well enough to participate in it in a productive way. The bundle of pine boughs tied with inner bark cord. That's basket-making behavior, or binding behavior, the behavior of something that manipulates fiber into useful forms. None of that is animal behavior, in the standard sense. All of it is consistent with a being that has been working this landscape for a very long time and has developed a deep practical knowledge of its resources and how to use them. I don't know what to call that. I don't know if science has a word for it yet. I know that whatever it is, it's been on the northeast ridge above my cabin for at least 60 years and probably a lot longer, and that it has apparently decided to tolerate my presence, and on one specific occasion to actively save my life. I consider myself in good standing on that ridge. I'm going to work to keep it that way. That's the complete story, start to finish, as honestly as I can tell it. I'm Dale Corrigan. I live on 42 acres in Clearwater County, Idaho. I heat with wood. Something on my northeast ridge keeps watch, and one morning in October of 2019, when I needed it most, it did more than watch. I don't think I'll be able to explain that fully for the rest of my life. I've made my peace with that. Thank you for listening to all of it. I've been asked by a few people who've heard parts of this story, mostly friends of Lloyd's who've heard second-hand versions, whether I believe in Bigfoot. I want to address that question directly because the framing of it matters. Believing in Bigfoot, the way people usually mean that, implies something like a religious or ideological commitment to a proposition despite uncertain evidence. That's not where I am. I'm not a person who goes looking for confirmation of something I've decided to believe. I'm a person who had a set of experiences, investigated them carefully and honestly, looked for explanations, and reached conclusions based on what the evidence supported. The evidence, in my case, supports the existence of a large, intelligent, non-human being on the northeast ridge above my cabin. It doesn't require belief in the sense of faith. It requires the same thing any working conclusion requires: enough evidence to make it the most plausible explanation for the available observations. The available observations include a SR incident report from a county emergency services agency listing transport mechanism as unknown, a cardiac catheterization report from a hospital in Grangeville documenting an lady stent placement in a 63-year-old man who should not have survived the time interval between his cardiac event and medical treatment. Photographs of foot impressions in soil, of felled timber laid in working rows, of a carved piece of wood sitting on my windowsill right now. Testimony from Craig Tollison, a professional paramedic, about the drag track in the meadow grass and the shape he was told about at the tree line. Testimony from Lloyd Breck about his father's account of the thing in the high country. Information from Rex Hollowell about Ivor Holstad's 60 years on this property and his reference to a tenant. A wildlife biologist with 23 years of Idaho fish and game experience who takes this seriously enough to have spent 20 years compiling reports. None of those things require belief. They require attention and honest assessment. I've given them both. This is where I ended up. The Selway Bitterroot Wilderness, on the eastern boundary of my property, is 4.5 million acres. 4.5 million acres of essentially roadless terrain, most of it above 5,000 feet, a significant portion above 7,000, closed to mechanized access by wilderness designation since 1964. The annual visitor count to the Selway Bitterroot is among the lowest of any designated wilderness in the lower 48 states. Large sections of it are functionally never visited by people. If you were designing habitat for a large, intelligent, privacy-seeking primate, you would be hard-pressed to do better than the Selway Bitterroot and the drainages that feed into it. That's not an argument. It's just context. The Loxa River drainage connects directly to the wilderness boundary. My northeast ridge is about 400 yards from the boundary. Whatever is on the ridge can be in the wilderness in a 15-minute walk. It lives in a corridor between the developed land along US 12 and the protected land to the east, and it can move through that corridor in both directions at will. When it wants to be near people, or near one person specifically, it comes down to the ridge above the cabin. When it's done, it goes back into the wilderness. 4.5 million acres. It has room. I've made peace with not having all the answers. I've made peace with having a question mark at the center of my life on this property where a certainty used to be. The certainty was that I knew what lived in these hills, that I could account for it, that the natural world above the Loxa was comprehensible to me, the way it had always been comprehensible to a man who'd worked in it and around it for most of his adult life. That certainty is gone. What replaced it is something I find, in the end, more interesting. The acknowledgement that there is something here I don't fully understand, something that has been here for a very long time, something that appears to have found me acceptable. I don't take that for granted. Every morning when I go up to the splitting area, I check the sorting wall. I look at the top round. If there's something there, I photograph it, and I leave it alone. If there's nothing, I get to work. The jays and the nutcrackers tell me what I need to know about what's in the upper drawer. When they go quiet, I stand still and wait and pay attention. When they come back, I continue. That's the life I've built on 42 acres in Clearwater County, Idaho, in my 63rd year. I heat with wood. I take my aspirin. I keep the inReach on my belt when I'm above the cabin. I check in with Lloyd. I watch the northeast ridge in the evenings when the light is good. And I take care of the ground, the way Holstad took care of it before me, the way the people who knew this country before either of us took care of it in their time. The tenant is still there. The terms of the arrangement seem to be holding. That's enough for now.